there's a narrow belt on Earth. A place where strange things seem to happen again and again, almost like the impossible keeps repeating itself. Here, the first crops were sown, the first megaliths raised, the first metals coaxed into shape by human hands. And this pattern reaches back into the Ice Age. Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, cave art, and burial rites all cluster in the same zone, as though following a star urged every leap forward. Then, 2 millennia ago, the belt flared again. 4 cultures along this line saw logic emerge suddenly, fully formed, as if a new operating system for the human mind had been installed. It happened independently, and just in these 4 places, Athens, Yavne, Taxila, and Luoyang. The wild thing is, they all share the same narrow belt.
And now to the Schumann Radiant. If we look at the northern latitude where the 4 earliest centers of logical thought appeared, we find they all fall within a very narrow band. That's hard to explain. They're located within a band stretching from 32 to 38 degrees north latitude. And it's still unclear why there are exactly 4 of these schools, spread out in a way that essentially covers all of Eurasia.
Science fiction readers may recall the Strugatsky brothers' Roadside Picnic, where Pilman's Radiant marks a sky point from which alien visitation zones trace back. Today's scholars have borrowed that image for history, calling this conceptual point of alignment the Schumann Radiant, as if breakthrough ideas radiate from it, rather than develop gradually. Why do so many turning points, so many firsts, cling to this band? Is it the climate, trade routes, or something deeper? Maybe even contact with a non-human intelligence? An encounter that left no ruins or relics, but minds quietly and forever changed.
After all, what do we know about these civilizations when we don't even know if they exist at all?
If humanity was ever visited or contacted by another civilization, the first traces wouldn't be in stone or metal. The earliest signs would be mental, subtle shifts in thought and perception in how we reason. The experience would have been so profound, so life-altering, it would leave deep traces in the human mind. Cognitive artifacts. That's exactly what Professor Andrew Schumann, a scholar at the crossroads of artificial intelligence and history, is investigating. The archaeology of logic. Logic, as a science, reflects deep shifts in human thinking. It marks revolutions in cognition just as clearly as ruins mark ancient cities. But what makes it so special? Isn't logic just common sense?
For some reason, it seems to us that logic is something akin to common sense. Accordingly, we believe that logic is some kind of inherent mechanism in all rational thinking. This was also believed for a long time. There was even such a direction in the 19th century called psychologism of logic. It was believed that logic is embedded in human psychology. But thanks to 2 very important authors, Kahneman and Tversky, it was proven through experiments that humans do not think logically at all. A person can think logically only in certain cases and only to a certain extent. For example, there was an experiment. They tested the knowledge of basic logical conclusions, and the conclusions were only in one step. So these are not complex logical reasoning. They tested scientists from very large American universities. Accordingly, it can be said that these are truly high-class scientists. And it turned out that they made errors at a very noticeable percentage. That is, that they completed different deductions with varying degrees of success, but somewhere from 60 to 90%. Meaning, even these groups did not achieve 100%. From this, Kahneman and Tversky conclude that we actually do not think logically, but through so-called cognitive biases. And all these optical illusions actually arise from this problem. The fact that I do not see the world the same way. I see the world through cognitive biases, sometimes focusing, sometimes unfocusing. There is a lot of research on this topic. And it turns out that logic that moves away from cognitive biases is definitely not some kind of innate mechanism. Naturally, it is very difficult for us to think logically. In experiments with animals, in regard how they implement logical schemes, it was found that they implement logical schemes better in stressful situations. This is also a very interesting conclusion, that it's difficult for us to think logically. Logic causes both tension and stress for us, and we are more likely to think logically in stressful situations. But it doesn't mean that we will start thinking logically for 100%. It just means that it will increase to some extent. Therefore, logic is not an innate ability. Similarly to mathematics, by the way. Logic must be learned. And the emergence of such a complex logical schemes all at once? Well, this is kind of a mystery.
The earliest schools of logic we know of appeared in just 4 places: Athens in Greece, Yavne in Judea, Taxila in India, and Luoyang in China. And beyond these, nowhere else. Not before and not since. Every other system of reasoning known today is either an import or an adaptation of one of these 4. What's common? There are reasoning rules found in the Talmud, known as the Midot. There are 7, 13, or 32 of them well known. But in reality, there are hundreds, including rare and subtle ones. And here's the strange part. Almost every one of these rules has a counterpart in all 4 logical schools. Not identical, but equivalent enough to raise eyebrows. It's as if these 4 cultures each developed their own versions of formal logic. And outside this narrow group, nothing like it ever emerged on its own. Every other system borrowed these rules.
Well, among such rules, one can note, for example, the rule Call Wahomer. This is a rule of reasoning called in Latin a fortiori. It means if some property holds for objects with a much larger characteristic of something, then the same property will hold for objects with a smaller characteristic. For example, if this rule, or let's say, some court decision applies to people who behave worse, then it will apply to people who behave better. This example of the logical rule Call Wahomer that I've just mentioned is also widely used in the arguments of Greco-Roman orators and in Jewish culture. It can be found even in the New Testament, where there are examples of applying of this rule. The very same rule, conclusion by analogy, is used in Buddhist schools of logic, such as Yogacara and Nyaya. And this same rule of inference by analogy, through appeals to the greater or lesser, is also used in Chinese culture. So we see that the set of some basic reasoning rules, taken as logicians, meaning form the perspective of their structure, is practically identical.
And here's something crucial. These weren't just dry, logical rules. They were also rhetorical tools, designed to move us, to persuade, to speak to our emotions as much as to our reason.
For example, synecdoche, a rhetorical device, appears once again in these same 4 cultures.
A classic example of synecdoche is all hands on deck. Here, the word hands refers to the sailors. A part, hands, is used to represent the whole person, creating vivid, compact language that resonates emotionally and visually with the listener. And these new, complex systems of logic didn't evolve slowly. They appeared suddenly, fully formed, and remarkably sophisticated. Even stranger, they emerged not in one place, but in 4, at nearly the same time, and most importantly, independently. How is it that all 4 of the earliest epicenters of logical inquiry and reflection emerged along the same narrow band, roughly around the 36 degrees north latitude line?
It's important to note that from a geographical standpoint, the appearance of this belt is difficult to explain. Take the Eurasian steppe corridor, that often cited as a source of cultural exchange, but it lies significantly farther north. So even if we consider contacts with nomadic groups from those regions, it still doesn't account for the emergence of this specific belt. There are exactly 4 of these schools, and together they span the entire breadth of Eurasia. From the west, starting in Athens, and all the way to Luoyang in the east, in northern China, reaching the far edge of East Asia.
In a way, the revolution in thinking was inevitable. Perhaps what we now call the Schumann Radiant served for one purpose: to ignite it. There's another curious coincidence hidden in this belt. All 4 ancient logic schools sit near the world's earliest agricultural hearths that appeared thousands of years before. And not just close. They fall within zones less than 1,000 kilometers wide, the same ones Nikolai Vavilov marked as independent cradles of Neolithic agriculture. It looks like more than a coincidence. The Neolithic revolution began within a narrow band of latitude as well. In the Old World, it was the Levant and sites like Göbekli Tepe. In the New World, it was mound-building cultures like Watson Break and Poverty Point. And in both cases, the shift wasn't just toward agriculture. In both cases, it came hand in hand with monumental structures, megaliths or massive earthworks. Analysis shows that the same narrow band of latitude gave rise to both revolutions. First, the birth of agriculture and the rise of megalithic or massive earthwork structures, and later, the emergence of formal logic and abstract reasoning. But why megaliths? At first glance, these phenomena seem unrelated. Megaliths and mounds, though different in technology, both demanded coordination, abstract thinking, long-term planning, and memory carried across generations. In that sense, they're not just monuments. They can be seen as cognitive exercises. A kind of brain trainer, if you will. Maybe even tools for anchoring entirely new ways of thinking. First came agriculture, then came advanced logic. And somewhere in between, the megalithic cultures vanished, perhaps because they had served their purpose. These weren't isolated events, but different waves of the same deep process unfolding slowly along the same narrow belt of the Earth. But to pinpoint the origins of that breakthrough in human thinking, we have to be precise. In a true school of logic, reasoning becomes a science. But here's the problem.
The thing is, logic has a unique trait. It emerges immediately as a science. Unlike astronomy, which had astrology as its precursor, or chemistry, which came out of alchemy, or physics, which grew from natural philosophy, logic appears in a complete, finished form from the start. Take Aristotle's Organon, now lost treatises that survived in fragments in Chrysippus' work. They already present logical knowledge at the level of modern logic. There's no earlier, proto-stage, no equivalent of alchemy or astrology in its development.
This anomaly hasn't gone unnoticed by scholars. The question was already raised by Immanuel Kant and more recently by scholars like Jens Lemansky, who pointed out that modern logic had non-revolutionary changes that take place within the revolutionized method. However significant these changes of course may be, they do not change the fundamental method. Within modern logic, there is a whole series of different non-revolutionary improvements, which can be of a technical or content-related nature. In other words, when this new logic appears, it arrives fully formed. There have been refinements, but no revolution since then. No step forward or backward. And that's what makes this moment in history so strange. What we're seeing is not a slow evolution, but a sudden hyper-jump in human thought. A form of logic that didn't gradually emerge, but appeared fully formed, as if ready to go. And everything our civilization is built on began with it. Even more curious, it happened in just 4 cultures, all aligned along a narrow band of the Earth, beneath what's now proposed as Schumann's Radiant. Was it the legacy of a forgotten civilization's thinkers, or something truly anomalous? A kind of paleocontact marked at 4 separate sites by encounters with the unidentified anomalous phenomenon.
On one hand, the theory of paleocontact in the narrow sense is, of course, not scientific, if we're talking about a contact that supposedly took place in the ancient world with a non-human intelligence. We don't have strict evidence for that. But if we take paleocontact in a broader sense, it becomes a kind of encounter with the other, an encounter with something fundamentally different, where the other is understood as a philosophical concept. It's unclear what it implies. Is it some kind of inner archetype? A representative of an alien culture I encountered, and through that, gained some insight? Or is it the Almighty? In this broader understanding, there's certainly room for hypotheses about possible encounters with the other.
We still don't know how this other may have manifested in the ancient world. Was it something from Earth or something otherworldly? An alien influence or something ancient and local? A visitor or a neighbor from a world that coexists with our own?
Another matter, of course, is that I would never dare to assert, especially in front of such an audience, no, under no circumstances, there are no other forms of intelligence in the universe. And all this gigantic, unimaginably gigantic emptiness, in which billions and billions of stars are scattered, that these worlds are uninhabited, that we are completely unique in the universe. But I cannot recommend for myself or for humanity to rely on the existence of alien intelligent beings.
There are different ways to look at how civilizations came to be. One view is isolationist. It says that different cultures developed separately, each growing on its own path. Another view is called diffusionism. It suggests that, from time to time, big leaps happen, sudden jumps in technology or social systems that can't be easily explained. The idea of paleocontact, for example, fits within this diffusionist view, because in both cases, we observe the same pattern: sudden breakthroughs with no clear precursor, knowledge or systems that seem to arrive fully formed rather than slowly evolve. It's as if something was introduced rather than discovered.
Indeed, for example, if we look at the emergence of the Neolithic, it turns out that the earliest center appears in just one location, southern Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey, and it emerges quite abruptly. I can give an example that shows just how difficult this leap is to explain. If we look at the megalithic complex at Göbekli Tepe, we find an enormous number of animal depictions, dozens and dozens of them. And not just common animals, but rare ones too. Various reptiles, different species of birds, and so on. And if we now turn to the cave paintings of the Upper Paleolithic, then to our surprise, we find that in the Upper Paleolithic, we see a very narrow range of animals, a narrow range of species. Mostly these are bison, bears, horses, mammoths, and some incomprehensible geometric figures or ornaments. In Göbekli Tepe, there is a sharp increase in the number of different animal species. What does this mean for us? It signifies a sudden leap in thinking. The human universe at Göbekli Tepe becomes incredibly complex over a fairly short period of time, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500 years. It rapidly grows more intricate. And then it turns out that certain centers of spontaneous technological innovation can, in a broader sense, be interpreted as a kind of paleocontact, some kind of encounter with something or someone.
Göbekli Tepe is a remarkable site, not just for its age, but for the unusual design of its megalithic T-pillars. Unlike the animal carvings that clearly depict species as they appear in nature, These towering stone forms are anthropomorphic, yet their shape mirrors nothing from the natural world. They are deliberately abstract. It's as if the builders were reaching for something symbolic, or even something that felt alien to them. The 23rd of October, 1965, Long Prairie, Minnesota. A local radio announcer, James Townsend, reported a curious UFO encounter to the Project Blue Book. He was driving along a country road near his hometown when he saw an upright, rocket-shaped object straddling the road. It was about 9 to 12 meters high and about 3 meters in diameter, and seemed to be resting on legs or fins.
My car engine, lights, and radio went out as I slammed on the brakes. I stopped about 20 feet in front of it. My first thought was to knock it over with the car, so I could have some evidence that the engine was dead. Then I got out, with the idea of trying to push it over by hand. When I got to the front of my car, 3 creatures came out from behind the rocket. They looked like individual tin cans on tripods, and were about 6 inches tall. They didn't have eyes, but I knew they were looking at me. I stopped. I didn't have any desire to get closer. There was no sound, just dead silence. It seemed like ages that we looked at each other. Then they went up into the rocket, which had a bright, colorless light glowing out of the batten. There was a loud hum. The craft went up and disappeared from view. As soon as the light on the bottom of the rocket went out, after the thing was in the air, my car radio and lights went on, and my engine started without me having to touch the starter.
Though not exactly the same, there's something eerily similar between the creatures depicted at Göbekli Tepe and those described in modern anomalous encounters. The level of abstraction in their form. In both cases, we see figures that appear anthropomorphic, but almost inorganic, technological, etched in straight lines and simple geometric shapes, almost like a sign, rather than an object. These forms feel oddly familiar to us, modern humans raised in the technosphere. Today, someone can be born in a city, die in a city, and never once touch the wilderness. We live surrounded by angular, artificial structures. But for ancient people who lived in close contact with nature, such forms would have been shockingly alien. Utterly other. Sites like Göbekli Tepe may be interpreted as sacred centers, founded for a new kind of cult, what today we might call the religion of a contactee. Just as modern culture has turned the UFO phenomenon into a mythology of technology, the ancients may have shaped their own beliefs around something they couldn't explain. These monuments could well be the memory of a hierophany, marking a place where the sacred descended to earth, leaving behind a donation and a message. To illustrate this thought, we can recall the opening scene of 2001: A Space Odyssey. A group of early hominids, outmatched by a rival tribe, wakes to find an anomalous object. The monolith, a mysterious presence standing silently. The monolith and the idea it ignites pushes them to craft the first weapon. It becomes the spark of a new evolutionary path, one that leads to human dominance. It also reflects a deeper truth. The human psyche is astonishingly responsive to subtle signals. Sometimes, it might take no more than a strange shape, reduced to weird signs, something just outside the bounds of the familiar to launch an avalanche of thought patterns. Arthur C. Clarke's insight is striking. Not all gifts from the unknown are benign.
If it were up to me to decide whether or not we should make contact with representatives of an alien civilization who've landed here, I'd suggest the following. Come on, comrades, hop back into your saucer and fly far away, at least 1,000 parsecs from Earth. And let's make a deal. Come back in 200 years. Just please, not to Earth. Land on the North Pole of a distant, icy planet Pluto. That's where we'll meet. And if we don't, fly off again and return in another 200 years. We'll see how things look then. That's how I see it. This extremely problematic and extremely unlikely idea of Earth being visited by representatives of distant civilizations.
And this is where the story gets complicated and unmistakably religious. Striking encounters with the other appear throughout traditional lore, including in ancient China, where origin stories of their earliest symbolic systems often begin with such mysterious contact. Two symbolic systems, later foundational for Chinese mathematics, are said to have emerged from the rivers. One, in particular, appeared on the back of a mythical turtle that rose from the Luo River. The fascinating part is, they interpreted it as a symbol of divine revelation, where the natural order made itself visible. Now, for someone who has never seen anything technological, a saucer-like object rising from the water might easily be interpreted as the closest familiar form, the curved shell of a turtle. And just like in the ancient stories, encounters with the anomalous often bring something more. A donation or a revelation, gifted or imposed, that forever alters the life of the one who receives it. Sometimes it's coherent, but often it's not. Witnesses might describe the shape of the object or being, but what's harder to express is the experience itself. The information received in such encounters is often so strange, so paradoxical, that it sounds completely mad, even to the person describing it. And yet, what once seemed incomprehensible, or even delusional to ancient minds, might one day be recognized as revolutionary. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the encounter with a phenomenon isn't meant to transmit clear, literal knowledge. Maybe it works more like a clutch between minds, where symbols speak louder than words and better carry the signal. The stress of the encounter becomes the catalyst, a jolt to consciousness, a moment that weakens old patterns and makes space for a new to emerge. But not every mind is ready. It may take something rare, a mind prepared enough to truly comprehend. In the Blue Book case, the encounter might have been just that, a cognitive system check. Taking Jacques Vallée's hypothesis seriously, UFOs may not be extraterrestrial vehicles or simple misidentifications, but part of a control system. A process designed to monitor and subtly guide human perception. Much like a thermostat responds to fluctuations in temperature, the other could be testing the cognitive temperature of the observer during a manifestation. If no red flags are triggered, the phenomenon withdraws. Vallee is asking, what is the variable being controlled in this control system? Thermostats control temperature. Gyroscopes control the direction in which a rocket flies. What could a paranormal phenomenon control? He suggests that it is human belief that is being controlled and conditioned. It may not yet explain why the other needs the Schumann Radiant specifically, but it does explain why it only worked 4 times, with selected minds in 4 cultures alone. And as we see, it was just enough to make the revolution in thinking inevitable.
As a hypothesis, we can certainly assume that contact did occur. All right, but what kind of contact would that be? First of all, this would be contact with a super civilization. Can we in good conscience approve or recommend reaching out to this tentacle, claw, or whatever it might be? My deep conviction is that such things should absolutely not be done. First of all, I think that just the fact of such a landing, an open appearance among us on Earth, would unleash a massive wave of religious fanaticism. we'd probably be dealing with something astonishing, with the collapse of social order, the breakdown of discipline, the loss of responsibility toward society, toward families, and so on.
The arguments of Arkady Strugatsky are compelling. But what if the encounter with the other wasn't invited at all? It just happened, without consent or warning. Tailored to the chosen, wrapped in sacred meaning so it can be nested within a worldview unlike anything we hold today.
There's what we call mythical thinking. It took a leap during what's known as the axial age, coinciding with the emergence of the rational thinking, especially with the rise of logical schools. And I'd even say the axial age is better defined differently than how Karl Jaspers originally framed it. Not by the emergence of world religions like Zoroastrianism or Buddhism, but specifically through the rise of logical schools. And in this sense, you're right. Before the rise of rational thinking, the world was perceived through a far more layered and symbolic lens. Cultural anthropologists have studied this in depth. They didn't see consciousness as something separate from nature. So their practices, especially social ones, were often deeply woven into thematic and seasonal cycles. These practices could rest on a very complex foundation. People saw the world through a lens that embraced both outer and inner experiences, phenomena that were at once part of the external world and inner world reflections of their own consciousness. So if, hypothetically, there was some kind of paleocontact, they likely wouldn't have perceived it like we imagine in a science fiction style, but rather as some kind of their inner experience, an inner feeling that is woven into social practices, and that didn't separate cosmic rhythms from natural or social ones.
Such social practices are known today as cults and religions. And if we look at ancient texts as records of humanity's encounters with the phenomenon, if we try to see through their eyes, to understand what they believed and where they thought this strange new knowledge came from, then perhaps the answer might surprise us.
What's interesting is that in Judaism, specifically Rabbinic Judaism, it's believed that all logic and hermeneutics trace back to a single place, the city of Ur. That's where the Academy of Shem, the forefather of the Semites, and his descendant Eber was founded. And it's said that Abraham himself once studied there. And it was also Abraham who sent his children from the concubines to the east with gifts. And it is written in the commentaries that with gifts refers to the teachings of the Almighty, which were taught in this academy. So one could say that such an interpretation is possible, even a religious one, through contact with the Almighty in some rather unusual forms.
Ur was a major Sumerian center in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the world's first true cities. Over 5,000 years ago, they were already engineering vast irrigation systems, reshaping entire landscapes, turning desert into fertile land and transforming agriculture into a stable, year-round foundation for civilization. But Ur was more than an engineering marvel. It was the cradle of a new kind of thought. And surprisingly, despite the simultaneous rise of civilization in Egypt, with its rich symbolic and intellectual traditions, it wasn't there that formal logic first emerged. It happened in Ur. For reasons still not fully understood, this city gave birth not just to writing and record keeping, but to the earliest logical thinking.
Yeah, it definitely didn't work out in Egypt, but we can say where it did. If we consider not the formation of logical schools or theories of logic, but the very emergence of logical thinking itself, when a person begins to follow strict, algorithmic rules in reasoning, then it is getting even more interesting. This type of thinking arose in only one place in the world, and nowhere else. This type of thinking develops in the region of southern Mesopotamia. Roughly speaking, we already see strong examples of proper logical reasoning during the time of the Old Akkadian Kingdom and the Third Dynasty of Ur. That is, We're talking more than 4,000 years ago, which is a very long time, considering that formal logical schools appear in the 3rd millennium. But logical thinking itself took shape about 1,700 years before that. And where does it form? First of all, in two bodies of texts, legal codes and texts on divination, on prediction. The earliest known legal code, for example, comes from Ur-3 and is attributed to the ruler Ur-Nammu. And why is this code of interest to us? Because for the first time, legal acts are seen as logical conclusions drawn from some kind of base, from a kind of library. What today we'd call a data set. All the articles are structured as conditional reasoning. If, then. If someone commits such an action, then this will be the punishment. And accordingly, the legal act, the court decision, is based entirely on this data set. You could even say it functions like an expert system. And this legal reform under the 3rd dynasty of Ur had a tremendous impact. The law became something transparent, something understandable to its users, making court decisions much easier to predict. In other words, it's no longer a spontaneous decision. It's based on specific codices. I can read those codices myself or consult a lawyer who will explain what kind of court ruling I can expect in a given case. And this legal culture forming in southern Mesopotamia begins to spread by diffusion into other cultures, mainly through international trade law. And the second important corpus of texts is divination. What's interesting here is that almost every phenomenon can be interpreted through positive or negative signs. And the way these signs are distributed actually corresponds to modern Boolean algebra. In that sense, the divination texts also resemble a data set of conditional reasoning. If the sign is this, the outcome is favorable. If it's that, the outcome is unfavorable. There, the structure of Boolean algebra can be discerned, a fairly complex algebraic system that also appears from the unknown source alongside legal culture specifically in the territory of Mesopotamia. And as it spreads through international law, this culture effectively carries and spreads logical thinking.
Boolean algebra is a way of thinking in yes or no, true or false. It breaks complex questions into simple choices, on or off, 0 or 1. This is yet another colossal leap in human thought. More precisely, it was the birthplace of what we now call Boolean algebra, the algebra of modern thought itself. George Boole would only rediscover and formalize this system thousands of years later. But the Sumerians and Akkadians had already begun using these patterns of reasoning over 4,000 years before him. No other culture ever discovered it independently. This knowledge was given once, and only once. It's often assumed that ancient cultures like the Sumerians lacked abstraction because they didn't leave behind philosophical prose like the Greeks or Romans did. In contrast, early Mesopotamian texts like the Code of Hammurabi appeared dry and rigid compared to Aristotle's Politics, with no commentary or flowing argument. But this view misses something crucial. Code of Hammurabi is an architecture of reasoning built on structured datasets. To build something like it would take hundreds of Aristotles. One alone wouldn't be enough. Scholars of logic know that building a proper dataset requires a staggering level of abstraction. And in that sense, Aristotle's Politics isn't even in the same league. This logical thinking isn't expressed through rhetorical prose, but through rules that can be read, processed, and reasoned through algorithmically, using techniques like forward and backward chaining, meaning step by step, like a computer would. Forward chaining starts with the facts and moves forward to reach a conclusion. Backward chaining starts with a possible outcome and works backward to see which conditions must be true. It's the same reasoning behind expert systems and decision trees today. But astonishingly, it was already embedded in these ancient codes, long before the idea of an algorithm ever existed. Where Aristotle gives us speculative reasoning, Hammurabi gives us executable logic. To build such a code is the mark of a civilization thinking in structured algebraic terms. This pattern of thinking was adapted later in ancient Assyria, where the earliest concept of an electronic diagnostic assistant was born. There, medical symptoms were also collected into structured datasets, classified by color, black, yellow, red, temperature, hot, cold, and other attributes. It was in essence an early diagnostic engine, an electronic assistant in clay. Centuries later, Hippocrates became something like a human ChatGPT for that dataset. He generated flowing medical prose, borrowing the categories from the original Assyrian system and reshaping them into the humoral theory. But instead of building new datasets, he distilled existing ones into fluid philosophical prose. The structure was lost, and in its place came speculation. Logic is a form of technology, a tool for structuring thought. And like any well-designed system, it can be repurposed, used for legal reasoning or moral judgment, even predictive modeling.
In fact, logical thinking is instrumental. It's rational thinking, aimed at achieving specific goals through algorithms. This is goal-directed thinking. But not all thinking works this way. Some of it is value-oriented. But goal-directed thinking develops thanks to logical culture, through the understanding that some goals can be reached purely by algorithms, in clear, transparent ways understood by everyone. Like, say, the shortest path between 2 points is a straight line. This is where the focus on achieving goals through algorithms begins to appear. And we see it across different cultures. For example, in China, traditions emerge where, you could say, a kind of early Machiavellianism takes shape, where the end justifies the means. And so this logical culture itself is, of course, no longer tied to any particular values, meaning it can be used as a tool for very different purposes.
Logic brings fairness, preserves memory, and keeps working across generations. But something also gets lost along the way. As logic sharpens, space for intuition, balance, and informal wisdom begins to shrink. There's a temptation to reduce everything to rules and to dismiss whatever doesn't fit the system. Yet some schools of thought try to overcome these limits. All 4 logical traditions emerged along the same line, but within different cultural and religious worlds, they gave them room to wrestle with this very tension. One example, ancient China.
I should add that these are, of course, very different cultures, each with its own emphasis and distinct social practices. If we look at Chinese culture, it's an attempt to organize society as a diverse whole governed by a single heavenly order. Legal, ethical, and social life are seen as inseparable, offering a completely new way of understanding social practices compared to the 3 earlier cultures. So, while social practices differ, the logical patterns, what we might call logemes, remain consistent. These are basic rules of inference, considered apart from any specific content. We focus purely on the structure of reasoning itself. And within these logematic structures, the reasoning patterns themselves, we find they're almost identical. The differences between the logemata are minimal.
Much like early Christianity and Vaishnavism, one of the major Hindu traditions, Chinese philosophy used analogies to explore big ideas. Universal ethics, social justice, and the balance between law and morality. In Chinese thought, logical reasoning was a tool for making compassion universal and building a just society. This reveals a deeper pursuit, the search for harmony with the cosmos. In this sense, it echoes another concept from the science fiction world of the Strugatsky brothers, the Progressors. Progressors are agents of advanced civilizations who intervene quietly and carefully in the development of less advanced worlds. Their mission is to guide, uplift, and sometimes accelerate evolution without revealing themselves or imposing force. So one has to wonder. When we see the sudden rise of universal ethics, legal systems, and rational principles across distant cultures, could it resemble the quiet work of progressors, whoever they could be?
Well, I would say yes, of course. What we see is an explosion of rational thinking that doesn't really have a full prehistory. Yes, the Sumerian Akkadian culture may have laid the groundwork for it, but we haven't found any actual logical treatises from that time, and most likely we won't, because as I mentioned, the texts from that culture are of a very different type. And it turns out that within these four cultures, a crucial foundation for rational thinking emerges, already embedded within different religious practices and contexts. Because, of course, the differences between the Buddhist Hindu sphere, early Judaism, Greek philosophy, and Chinese philosophy are truly vast. But because of such colossal cultural differences, these schools later became foundational for very different cultures, like how Chinese culture became the mother tradition for Korean and Japanese civilizations. The truth is, we still can't fully explain how these leaps happened. I gave the example with Göbekli Tepe, where, aside from logical explanations, we still can't understand what happened. It can't be explained by climate, and culture doesn't account for it either, because the cultures were so different. In other words, there's something unclear here, almost in the style of Progressors.
The fact that these systems of logic were already deeply embedded in various occult and religious traditions is a striking discovery. It not only lends support to Karl Jaspers's theory of the axial age, which marks the period when universalizing modes of thought appeared across different regions in remarkable parallel, but also hints at something deeper. What started this spread? Seen from this angle, ancient cults that later grew into major world religions were also vehicles for embedding a new logic into human culture. And through them, this logic reached minds that had never encountered anything like it before. It was like a cognitive wildfire, less about who's better or worse, more about resetting the old and starting something entirely new. That's exactly what happened in the Slavic world. When the Bible was first translated into Church Slavonic, it brought with it a form of reasoning completely new to early Slavic culture.
Well, yes, it comes with Christianity. The thing is, the spread of Christianity involved a very serious effort to shape both language and thought. And it turns out that spreading the Bible among different peoples also became a major driver in developing a rich vocabulary, a philosophical vocabulary that made logical thinking possible. That is to say, the Bible itself became a key milestone, even in the development of logical thinking, because it was accompanied by theology, which had already been deeply shaped by Greco-Roman culture.
But was it just the language that changed the way people thought? Or was it something deeper within monotheism itself that carried this new logic? Because it seems that through this religion, an entirely new mental framework was implanted, one rich in metonymy, analogy, and structured reasoning. In other words, a new way of thinking.
Well, it's difficult to draw a direct connection with monotheism. Though it's worth noting that Greek philosophy had its own unique form of monism, something close to monotheism.
Monotheism is the belief in one personal God, a single divine being who is conscious, intentional, and often involved in human affairs. Monism, on the other hand, is a philosophical concept that sees all of reality as ultimately one substance or principle. This one might not be a god in the personal sense. It could be energy, consciousness, or an abstract unity.
That is, Zeus was seen as the one true god, while the other gods were more like his manifestations. For example, in Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, the one god exists beyond the cosmos. He is the one. It's a unified, all-encompassing god, one that includes the entire cosmos and takes on many forms. Very similar ideas can also be found in Aristotle. Very similar ideas were held by the Stoics. You could say they embraced a kind of monism-monotheism. Of course, it's hard for us to judge the finer details now, since we're interpreting all of this through surviving texts. A similar case can be made for the Yogacara system, where logic begins to appear. So does a philosophy of monism. By the way, it's very important that this philosophy of monism in Buddhism, emerging specifically in the northern regions like northern India and present-day Pakistan, later influenced the monistic philosophy of the Advaita Vedanta school. The fact is, in the early sutras of this school, we again find hidden quotations from Madhyamaka and Yogacara texts. This suggests that monism first emerges more clearly within the framework of Buddhism. And naturally, monism plays a very important role in ancient Chinese thought as well. The fact is, this reform of the Qin Empire, the very first empire, was carried out under a powerful slogan, all under heaven. This too reflects a monistic or even monotheistic idea, that since the sky is one, the lands beneath it must also be unified as one. And this unification of law, which occurs under the Qin Empire and spreads through the Han Empire, the codification of law and the turning of law into some unified mechanism for the whole empire, this also happens within the framework of monism. That is, we can say, yes, that logic is formed within the framework. Well, not so much of monotheism, because, for example, in Buddhism, there is no theism at all. But within this philosophy of monism, we see an attempt to build a unified system, one that brings together the cosmic order, the social order, and the natural order into a single whole. Similar ideas can be found, for example, in the works of Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, and within the traditions of Rabbinic Judaism. By the way, it's important to note that the key role now is played not by prophets, but by legal scholars, those who, not through direct revelation from the Almighty, but through logic and hermeneutics, could derive correct principles from the first 5 books of the Bible. And we see similar expressions of monism both in Buddhism and in ancient China.
But what about the New World? The Americas? Did it have its own radiant, a parallel point of awakening? Maybe even a missing 5th school of logic, born in isolation and perhaps never fully recognized?
The Neolithic origins in the New World are especially unclear, because in the Old World, we can trace a line of diffusion from that very first center where the Neolithic began. In the New World, this center seems to have emerged independently, most likely somewhere in what is now North America. At the same time, it's worth noting that a center of ancient urban civilization was already forming in South America, in the Andes, where early city cultures reached a fairly advanced stage of development around 5,000 years ago. That's a very long time ago. But even in this context, we can't say that any form of rational thinking emerged there. We have texts. Many Maya texts have survived, as well as texts from the Aztecs. Yet in these writings, we find no evidence of a logic-based, rational mode of thought. The Mayan texts themselves show a logical structure remarkably similar to the so-called pyramid texts. The oldest known texts from the Old World, dating back as far as 5,000 years and studied in great detail. Even though the pyramid texts can be read, their meaning often remains unclear. They're filled with dense metaphors and hyperboles that are difficult for us to fully grasp. What are they even about? Very often, the narrative lacks a rational sequence, making it hard to understand the meaning of the pyramid texts at all. And we see a very similar situation with the Mayan texts. Of course, they can be read and interpreted, but the way the symbols are arranged shows no clear logical sequence. So it's fair to say that formal logic emerged only in the Old World and nowhere else.
The Schumann Radiant might hold even more surprises. It might also reveal a hidden connection to the ancient cult of a forgotten goddess, a mysterious presence that quietly united vast territories within this narrow belt in the Old World.
You could even say that this entire belt was, to some extent, unified by a shared religious cult. There was a special cult of the Mother Goddess in Syria, which, by the way, lies right along the 36th parallel north. The Mother Goddess always played a central role. Among the Phoenicians, she appeared as Anat. Among the Syrians, she later took on the Greek name Tyche, the goddess of fate, the Mother Goddess. This same figure, with nearly identical iconography, became central in both Hinduism and Buddhism of the time. In Sanskrit, she was known as Harati. It was some kind of a deity and originally a child-eating demoness. She embraced Buddhism and transformed into a guardian of families, childbirth, and children. The same goddess was also widespread among the Iranian peoples, where she was called Nana. Interestingly, the word Nana became associated in many languages with midwives, elder women, and grandmothers. In Hindi, Nani means grandmother. Nana means grandfather. The word exists in Farsi too. Even the Russian word nyanya, nanny, likely comes from the same root. There are two hypotheses. One suggests Nana is a baby talk word that's easy for children to pronounce. But that doesn't explain why it's specifically associated with grandmothers or women tied to childbirth and care. So for Iranians, it was Nana. And I haven't added yet that for the Romans, it was the goddess Cybele, who is also in that iconography, or Tyche, also in that iconography. This goddess was invariably associated with a lion or tiger. And the most ancient representations of this goddess are the goddess Nanaya, or Inanna, or Ishtar in the Sumerian Akkadian culture. By the way, the Egyptian Sekhmet is also closely connected to this goddess. So, it turns out that in this region indeed, in the early years, the cult of one goddess played a very important role, a goddess who had different names but the same function. And it was quite obvious to representatives of these different cultures that this was the same goddess.
What's fascinating is that the cult of the Mother Goddess seems not only to follow a specific path, emerging before cities or pottery and spreading from the Balkans to the Indus Valley, but it also seems to restart again and again whenever a specific formation of stars aligns with the Schumann Radiant in the sky. All four of these ancient cities sit near the 36th parallel north, within what's now proposed as Schumann's belt. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. If you stood under the night sky at this latitude between the 3rd century BCE and the 3rd century CE, you'd notice something beautiful and strange. Every year in April, a meteor shower called the Lyrids lights up the sky. Its radiant, the point where the meteors seem to come from, sits near a bright star named Vega. And Vega was special.
And in this case, it's interesting that being on the same latitude of the northern hemisphere, these cultures, formed at approximately the same time, observed roughly the same sky. That is, the daily and yearly rotations of the sky were identical at this latitude. In this regard, there is an opportunity for some speculations that logic was formed within cultures that observed the same sky with the same patterns of the appearance of planets, stars, and meteorites. So, the Schumann Radiant is an attempt to find the radiant point for this specific latitude, and for this belt specifically.
Back then, just as the last light of evening faded, Vega and the Lyrid meteor shower would rise in the east, right on cue, night after night. It climbed high into the sky, right above your head, shining at its brightest just before dawn.
Interestingly, it turns out that 4 very bright stars passed through the zenith over the course of the year back then. That's quite unusual from the astronomical perspective, having 4 of the brightest stars take turns appearing at the zenith in different seasons. And so, Sergei Govoruka proposed calling this phenomenon the Schumann Radiant. What we're observing is the emergence of celestial bodies that follow the same patterns that are remarkably consistent across a broad stretch from Europe to East Asia, all within a narrow band of northern latitude.
Over thousands of years, the Earth slowly wobbles on its axis like a spinning top. This motion, known as precession, gradually shifts the positions of stars in our sky. So today, if you stand on the 36th parallel, you won't see Vega reaching the same high point it did 2,000 years ago. But this pattern, of course, had played out once before in the deep past, around 11.5 millennia ago. At that time, observers within the Schumann belt, including those at Göbekli Tepe, would have witnessed a remarkable cycle. 4 stars, 3 of them among the brightest in the sky, appearing to pass through the Schumann Radiant overhead, one after another throughout the year. It was a formation that marked the heavens near the end of the last ice age, a time of accelerating climate shifts and a global upheaval as the world began to warm and change. A moment of intense environmental stress when the world was changing, and perhaps so was the human mind. If ancient people tracked the stars, and we know they did, they would have witnessed this celestial sequence unfold every night over that same narrow band of Earth. This gives the Schumann Radiant a deeper meaning and connection with real astronomical markers. Ancient carvings around the Göbekli region, including the Kilisic statue, mirror Göbekli Tepe's symbolism, reflecting the birthing posture. The vulva-shaped opening and fetus-like form above embody themes of birth and emergence. Though found nearby, the Kilisic statue reflects the same mythic language. Researchers have shown that Göbekli's enclosures were aligned with Deneb, the brightest star in Cygnus, as it set around 9,500 BCE, suggesting a deliberate link to a meteor radiant that might be celestial symbol of cosmic birth. The idea of 4 brilliant stars rising high above the Schumann Radiant, then vanishing for centuries, is both striking and poetic. As if their disappearance stirred some deep, ancestral stress in the minds of those below, unsettling a cosmic rhythm they once trusted. But it feels like just one piece of a much larger picture. Stress alone? It happens constantly, and yet it rarely leads to such complex shifts in human thought. There has to be something more to this story. Something else at work. And there is a strong candidate. The theory that suggests the universe itself isn't the same in every direction. That space and time behave differently depending on where you are on the planet. This idea is known as the Anisotropic Universe, and one of its most compelling voices was physicist Simon Schnoll. He was a biophysicist and also a brilliant experimentalist. After decades of precise measurements, he started to notice something strange, and so did other scientists. Patterns in physical processes, like radioactive decay or chemical reactions, would fluctuate in sync with cosmic rhythms, and these patterns varied depending on location on the planet. It's not that something flows through these places in the usual sense, but that each direction in space may correspond to a different rhythm or texture of time, a distinct expression or visage of time itself. This is what Schnoll described as the many visages of time. We don't yet fully understand the role stars like Vega, Arcturus, and Deneb played, but their positioning may not have been without meaning. Maybe they help reveal a kind of hidden pattern in time, its special visage, strangely consistent through millennia. If you understood the hidden patterns of time and the subtle rhythms we're only beginning to detect, there might be no need to intervene directly in each culture at all. Just a well-timed signal sent from afar could be enough to set the entire system in motion. Maybe all you need is some kind of a platform, somewhere in a deep space, locked onto the spinning Earth below. And when the timing is just right, you fire, like a bullet from a revolver, striking the planet along a radiant line, altering its cognitive space, sending a perfectly timed signal, subtle yet like the butterfly effect, triggering changes that require no micromanagement, and allowing human systems to self-organize in response, forever shifting the fate of those living along and just beyond the 36th parallel. Since the earliest times, humans have carried a quiet fear that we are not truly free, that we might be automatons, acting out scripts written by gods or unseen forces. In many ancient cultures, fate wasn't a choice but more like a program one is doomed to execute. Prophecy, divine will, the stars above, all pointed to the same unsettling truth. We act, but the script was written for us. There was little room for choice, but with the birth of formal logic, the game leveled up. Humanity may have been handed a tool to break the script for the first time in history. A technology not just to reshape our fate, but to grant the freedom to ask deeper questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What are we doing here?
This problem was first raised by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He distinguished between formal logic, the logic of abstract schemes or logiums, and what he called transcendental logic, where the structure of reasoning already presupposes a subject of pure will, which he referred to as the transcendental subject. And now, a crucial challenge for logicians and engineers working in artificial intelligence is to understand how consciousness can be embedded within the logic system itself. Well, the groundwork for this has already been laid. One of the greatest mathematicians and logicians of the 20th century, Alan Turing, developed what we now call the Turing machine. In fact, nearly every modern computer functions as a version of this abstract machine, which explicitly describes the process of computation. But at the same time, he also proposed a Turing machine with an oracle. These are machines that, in a sense, possess a form of consciousness, but they remain abstract. We still don't fully understand how to implement them in real-world systems. Oracles, in this context, are a way to approach reality by postulating the existence of unsolvable arithmetic functions. I can give an example to make this clearer. We're now entering the era of neural networks. For those who haven't used ChatGPT or similar bots, it's easy to misunderstand what they really are. Neural networks don't actually think, they only simulate thinking. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone walks into a kitchen they've never seen before. Their task is to make coffee, but everything is arranged differently. Still, they manage to figure it out and brew a cup pretty quickly. That's a task solved efficiently, in a short amount of time. But if we try to teach a neural network to make coffee, it has to learn each kitchen separately. It can't generalize across all kitchens. To adapt, it would need to go through millions of training iterations just to handle one setup. It has to check nearly everything in the kitchen, making countless mistakes along the way. The weights in its model keep shifting until it finally strikes a balance, just enough to make coffee in that one setup. And this highlights a core problem with robotics. Robots still struggle with tasks that humans solve effortlessly. Why? Because humans seem to rely on these oracles, tapping into functions that are mathematically unsolvable, yet somehow help us act effectively, like making a cup of coffee. Neural networks can only simulate the solution to such a task. So the next frontier in logic is figuring out how to embody living consciousness within a logical system, so that a robot, for example, could walk into any kitchen and make coffee in 5 minutes. Right now, no such robot exists.
Maybe not. Maybe not in the way we get used to imagining robots. Maybe some very ancient and very advanced super civilizations faced a similar problem and solved it somewhere within the Schumann's Radiant in a time long, long forgotten. So we have 4 cultures, each with a fully developed system of logical thinking. And beyond them, it never appeared again. Everywhere else, the methods of reasoning were borrowed. And no, this kind of reasoning wasn't innate. Someone built them consciously. And it happened in just 4 places: Athens, Yavne, Taxila, and Luoyang. All of them sit close to the 36th parallel north, falling beneath the Schumann Radiant. So, do we have any good scientific theory that explains why modern logic seems to have no history?
No theories at the moment. To explain this, there is a hypothesis. For instance, I proposed one idea: the emergence of a rational thinking ecosystem through the development of commercial law. This, in some way, could offer a partial explanation, but it still doesn't tell us why the leap occurred specifically in these 4 cultures, right along this narrow band of northern latitude. After all, by that time, the Silk Road already spanned vast territories, including routes through the Red Sea to the western coast of India. At that time, they were already beginning to move through the Ganges Valley and explore the coastline of South Asia. The very first colonies were starting to appear there. That is to say, it's quite a vast territory now beginning to come under the influence of this new trend. Rational thinking, shaped through the development of commercial law, but why it emerged specifically in this area still remains a mystery. You could try to explain it climatically, let's say, but that doesn't quite work either. The climate zones differ. Just compare the Yellow River Valley with the territory of present-day Afghanistan. Afghanistan, for instance, is arid and far less favorable for agriculture than the Huanghe Valley. So we see there's really no solid explanation for why these trends emerged precisely within this narrow band, which naturally opens the door to the idea of some kind of contact with other, where this other is something we don't know. It could have been a religious practice, a goddess cult no longer well understood. It could have been the Almighty, or something else entirely, a reason still beyond our grasp.
And that's the challenge. Once a hypothesis emerges, it's tempting to use it to explain everything. But history isn't a simple tale. It's a complex system shaped by countless forces, especially when one of those forces is contact with the other. And the Schumann Radiant still lingers out there, waiting for its next moment to ignite.
Another question is this. If we could now establish with certainty, without making any contacts, that we are not alone in the universe, This, of course, would have tremendous significance for all of humanity and would be of great philosophical, moral, ethical, and, frankly speaking, scientific importance. Direct scientific significance.